Korea, 1907. A man walks into a prayer meeting in Pyongyang and never walks out the same. But that's not where this story begins. It begins with a boy who was told, from the moment he could understand words, that he was destined for something. Not by a prophet, not by a vision in the night, by a father who believed it so deeply that he shaped every hour of his son's childhood around it. The early mornings, the memorized scripture, the silence at the dinner table that was not cold but reverent, as though something sacred was always present just above the meal. The boy's name was Yong-jae, and if you have never heard that name, that is exactly the point. Because Yong-jae never became famous the way the world measures fame. He never preached to hundreds of thousands in open fields. He never founded a denomination or had his portrait painted. What he did was something quieter, and in some ways far more devastating. He became the kind of man whose life could not be explained except by God, and whose failures could not be explained away. His father, a Presbyterian elder in a small village outside of Pyongyang, had 4 sons. Yong-jae was the third. In a culture where birth order determined nearly everything, the third son was expected to be competent, dutiful, and invisible. But something about this particular third son refused invisibility. He read everything. By the time he was 10, he had read through the entire Bible twice, not because his father required it, but because he could not stop. There was a hunger in him that food did not satisfy. The other boys his age played outside until dark. Yong-jae would find a corner near the oil lamp and read until his eyes burned. His mother worried about him, not because he was sickly. He was healthy enough, but because there was a seriousness in his face that did not belong to a child. She would sometimes catch him staring at nothing, and when she asked what he was thinking, he would say, "I am trying to understand why God lets people suffer." She had no answer for him. She was a woman of faith, but she was also a woman of pragmatism. She needed the rice to cook, and the younger children to sleep. Abstract theology was a luxury she could not afford, so she would pat his head and tell him to go help his brothers with the wood. He helped with the wood. He always helped with the wood. But the question never left him. When Yong-jae was 15, the Great Revival broke out in Pyongyang, 1907. The year Korea shook. You have to understand what that revival was because it explains everything that came after. It began in a small church, Yong-jae Church, with a prayer meeting that should have lasted one evening. Instead, it lasted weeks. Men who had not wept in years wept until their shirts were soaked. Women confessed things they had hidden for decades. Pastors fell on their knees and could not get up. The sound of simultaneous prayer, everyone praying out loud at once, a roar of voices that was somehow not chaotic but unified, poured out of the building and into the streets of the city. People who heard it stopped walking. Some of them came in. Some of them never left. Yong-jae's father took him to one of those prayer meetings. He was 15, old enough to understand what he was seeing, young enough to have no defenses against it. He saw a man stand up in the middle of the gathering, a respected merchant, known throughout the district, a man who wore his reputation like a coat, and confessed publicly that he had stolen from a widow, not a little, a lot, over years. The merchant was weeping so hard he could barely form words, and when he finished, the room did not condemn him. The room prayed for him, and something about that, the combination of total exposure and total grace, broke something open in Yong-jae that had been sealed since childhood. He did not weep that night. He was not ready. But he walked home different. He told his father, "I want to spend my life doing that." His father said, "Then you will have to be willing to be broken first." He went to seminary in Seoul at the age of 19. This was 1912, 3 years after Japan had formally annexed Korea, and the country was in a particular kind of pain, the kind that does not announce itself, but sits in the chest of every person who walks down a street that used to belong to them and now does not. The seminary was a strange place during those years. Half the students had come to study theology. The other half had come because the church was the only institution the Japanese could not fully control, and some of them, not all, but some, were there more for the nation than for God. Yong-jae was not political. This bothered people. In that climate, neutrality felt like betrayal, and there were students who said so directly to his face. But he had seen what happened in that prayer meeting in Pyongyang. He had seen what a man's soul looked like when it was broken open before God, and he believed. with the stubbornness of someone who has decided something at 15 and cannot be moved, that a changed soul would change more than any political movement ever could. This was not a popular position, but Yong-jae had never been concerned with popularity. What he was concerned with, increasingly, was marriage. And here is where the story turns, because this is not only a story about revival and faith and the cost of following God. It is also a story about a man who was brilliant in the pulpit and bewildered in his own home, and about the particular kind of suffering that no one talks about because it does not make good sermons. Her name was Park Yoon-ha. She was the daughter of a deacon in the church Yong-jae attended during his seminary years, and she was, by every external measure, the right choice. She was educated, unusual for women of her generation in Korea. She was devout. She was capable, organized, and respected. Her father had raised her with a seriousness about scripture that matched Yong-jae's own, and when they met at a church gathering in the spring of 1914, there was a recognition between them that both of them interpreted as divine. It may have been. These things are difficult to untangle. What is certain is that they were married in the summer of 1914, and that within 6 months they both understood that they had made a significant miscalculation. Not about love. They did love each other, or at least the versions of each other they had known before marriage, the versions that existed in the formal, structured world of courtship, where everyone is performing the best of themselves. What they had not understood, could not have understood, was that two people of equal intensity and equal conviction locked into the same small space do not double the light. They create friction. Yong-jae preached with a fire that drew people to him, but that same fire in the home became something his wife experienced not as warmth but as pressure. He had opinions about everything, about how the household should be run, about the right way to raise children, about which scripture was most applicable to any given situation. He was not cruel, he was not violent, but he was relentless, and relentlessness, sustained over years, does its own kind of damage. Yoon-ha was not a woman who collapsed quietly. She was the daughter of a deacon, remember. She knew her Bible too, and she knew how to use it. Their arguments were not ordinary arguments, they were theological. They quoted scripture at each other across the dinner table. They disagreed about grace and about works and about what, precisely, the verse in Ephesians meant when it said, "Wives, submit to your husbands," a disagreement that was not, in the end, really about Ephesians at all, but about whether Yong-jae's opinions deserved to be treated as divine authority simply because he delivered them with conviction. They had 3 children in 6 years. Each child was wanted, each child was loved, and each child watched their parents move through the same house, like 2 weather systems that occasionally collided, and occasionally held an uneasy truce, but never quite achieved the peace that their father preached about on Sunday mornings. How does a man preach about the peace that surpasses understanding when there is no peace in his own bedroom? He preaches anyway. That is the honest answer, and it is more disturbing than it sounds. Yong-jae preached some of the most powerful sermons of his generation during the worst years of his marriage. People came from other districts to hear him. Young pastors took notes. He had a gift for making the ancient text feel immediate, personal, dangerous. As though the stories in Scripture were happening right now, right here, and the choice being offered to the man in the parable was the same choice being offered to the man in the pew. He was not a hypocrite in the way that word usually means. He believed what he preached. He lived it in certain ways. His discipline was extraordinary, his study habits legendary, his generosity with his time and money well documented. But there was a compartment in his life that he could not preach himself out of, and over time, the gap between the man on the platform and the man who came home at the end of the day grew wide enough that he could feel it in his chest when he crossed his own threshold. His wife felt it too, and her response, understandable, complicated, not simply the response of a difficult woman, but the response of a woman who had been promised one thing and given another, was to gradually withdraw the benefit of the doubt. She became a critic, not publicly, privately, in the home. In the small dailiness of the marriage, she had a gift for identifying the precise distance between what he said and what he did, and she named it, often with a specificity that he could not refute. He resented it. He called it bitterness. She called it honesty. They were probably both right. There was a period, his late 30s, when the tension in their home had become a kind of furniture they moved around without discussing. When colleagues who knew them well would not have believed what happened behind closed doors. Yong-jae would return from a week of meetings where he had spoken to hundreds of people about the love of God, walk through his own front door, and within an hour be in a silence so thick it had weight. He wrote in his journal during those years, not the official journal, the one his eldest son would eventually find and preserve. A different one. A small notebook with a cloth cover that he kept in the bottom of his desk drawer. In it, he wrote things he could not say from the pulpit, and would not say to any colleague. That he did not know how to be in the same room as his wife, without feeling that he had already failed her simply by walking in. That he sometimes stayed late at the church not because of work, but because the church was the only place where he felt competent. That he suspected God had given him a gift for reaching people and an equal and opposite inability to reach the one person who had chosen to share his life. That journal was lost, or perhaps destroyed. His son was never certain. The breaking point came in 1931. Yong-jae was 43 years old. He had been in ministry for nearly 20 years. He had baptized hundreds of people. He had sat with the dying and the newborn and everyone in between. He had weathered the early years of Japanese pressure on the Korean church, the growing restrictions on Christian gatherings, the slow erosion of the freedoms that had made the 1907 revival possible. And his wife left. Not forever. Not legally. Divorce carried a stigma in 1931 that was essentially incompatible with continued ministry, and both of them knew it. But she took the 2 younger children and went to her parents' home in Seoul, and she was there for 7 months. 7 months during which Yong-jae continued to preach. Because what else does a man do? He got up on Sunday mornings and walked to the front of the church and opened his mouth, and the gift was still there, terrible and intact. And the people who heard him never knew that his house was empty. His eldest son knew. Chun-soo was 17, old enough to understand, and young enough to be devastated. He stayed with his father, and he watched his father rise each morning at 5 for prayer, and go to bed each night still in his clothes, having fallen asleep at his desk. And he did not know whether to be awed or heartbroken. He was, in the end. Both later, much later, when Chun-soo was an old man himself, and people asked him about his father, he would say, "My father was a man who knew exactly what God required of him, and he spent his whole life trying to close the gap between what he knew and what he was. He never fully closed it, but he never stopped trying." I think that's what the word saint actually means. Not someone who succeeded, someone who kept trying. Yoon-ha came back. She came back in the winter of 1932, and no one outside the immediate family ever knew with certainty what had passed between them during those 7 months. Whether there were letters, whether there was a reconciliation conversation, whether something shifted in him or in her or in both. What changed, visibly, was the nature of his preaching. Before 1931, Yong-jae preached with authority, the kind of authority that comes from certainty, from the conviction that you have understood the text correctly, and the congregation needs to understand it too. After 1932, he preached with something harder to name, not less powerful, in some ways more powerful. But there was a grief in it now, a texture that had not been there before. When he spoke about failure, he did not speak theoretically. When he spoke about grace, it was not the grace of someone who had required very little of it. One colleague, a pastor from a neighboring town who had known Yong-jae for years, attended a service in 1934, and later wrote to a mutual friend, "Something has happened to Yong-jae. I do not know what." But when he preached on the prodigal son on Sunday, 3 men came forward at the end who I would have said were untouchable. Whatever has broken in him has made a door. Whatever has broken in him has made a door. The Japanese occupation deepened through the 1930s, and by 1938, the Korean church was facing a demand that would fracture it permanently. The requirement to participate in Shinto shrine worship. The government framed it as civic duty, not religious practice. Most church institutions, under enormous pressure, complied. Yong-jae did not comply. This was not a political statement. Or rather, it was not only a political statement. It was a theological one, rooted in the same conviction he had carried since the age of 15. that there was no transaction worth making between the soul and a lie, regardless of what the transaction cost you. It cost him everything practical. His church was closed. His ordination papers were revoked by the denomination that had, under pressure, submitted to the government's demands. He was placed under surveillance. For a period of nearly 2 years, he could not preach publicly at all. He preached privately, in homes, in small groups of 10 or 15, in the back rooms of shops, in the pre-dawn hours when the risk was lower. He carried his Bible inside his coat. He prayed with people in whispers. His wife was with him through all of it, not because the years had made everything easy between them. They had not, but because she was, at her core, the same woman who had loved the Bible since childhood. And she was not a woman who would bow to what was false even when bowing would have been convenient. In this, at least, they were exactly the same. There is a story, documented by one of the families who sheltered them during this period, that on a night when Yong-jae had just finished leading an illegal prayer meeting in a family's cellar, Japanese police came to the house. Yun-ha answered the door. She spoke to them for 20 minutes on the front step, while Yong-jae and the others remained silent in the cellar below, and whatever she said, whatever mixture of composure and deflection and sheer force of will she deployed, the officers left. He thanked her afterward. He said, "You were extraordinary." She said, "I was terrified." He said, "That's the same thing. It was not a healing of the marriage in one moment. That is not how marriages heal if they do. But it was a moment in which they saw each other clearly, perhaps for the first time in years. And what they saw was someone who had also been paying a price, quietly for a long time." Liberation came in August 1945. Japan surrendered. Korea was free, briefly, painfully, before the country divided itself or was divided, depending on who was telling the story. Yong-jae was 57 years old. He had outlived several colleagues. He had watched the revival of his childhood become in some ways a distant memory and, in other ways, a living root system running under everything. The faith still there, underground, waiting. He went back to preaching openly. His church was reconstituted. New people came, a younger generation that had grown up during the occupation and was hungry for something true. He taught them. He baptized them. He married their children and buried their parents. His wife became, in those last years, something he had not expected, his closest theological conversation partner. The children were grown. The house was quiet. And in the silence, the two of them, the man who had spent his career talking and the woman who had spent her career refusing to pretend, found that they had between them a combined understanding of Scripture and suffering that neither could have reached alone. He told someone, in one of the last interviews he gave before his health declined, "My wife has taught me more about the gospel than any seminary I attended. Not in the way I wanted to be taught, in the way I needed to be taught." Song Yong-jae died in 1961, in the same village where he had been born. He was 73 years old. Park Yun-ha survived him by 11 years and spent those 11 years continuing to teach a women's Bible study in the church they had rebuilt together. At his funeral, his eldest son Chun-soo gave the eulogy. He said what he would later repeat when people asked him about his father, that Yong-jae was not a man who had all the answers, that the private notebooks, the ones that survived, showed a man who was wrestling with God until the end, not theatrically, not performatively, but genuinely, in the way you wrestle with someone whose grip you cannot break and whom you would not want to break you any other way. He said that his father's marriage had been one of the great difficulties of his life, and that it had also been one of the great formations of his life, in the way that all genuine difficulty is formation if you do not run from it. He said, "My father learned to preach grace because he needed it. He learned to preach forgiveness because he had failed and been failed. He learned to preach about the God who does not abandon his people because there were years when he felt abandoned. And he held on anyway, and the holding on became the sermon." Here is what the history books, if they record Yong-jae at all, will not tell you: that the revival he participated in, the underground church he sustained, the hundreds of people who were baptized under his hands, none of it happened despite the difficult marriage and the broken years and the 7 months when his house was empty. It happened through it, not because suffering is romantic. It is not. Ask his wife, who carried her own quiet wounds. Ask his son who watched from the doorway. Ask the man himself who wrote in a cloth-covered notebook things he could never say from the platform. But because the thing that makes a person's voice carry, the thing that makes a sermon land not as information but as recognition, the thing that makes a stranger in a pew feel that the man speaking has been somewhere near the same dark room they have been sitting in, is not talent. It is not even faith exactly, though faith is part of it. It is cost. It is the particular weight of someone who has not been exempt from what they are asking you to endure. You can lose your platform and find it again. You can lose your health and recover. You can lose your standing in an institution and rebuild or simply outlast. But there is a kind of knowing that can only be purchased. It cannot be borrowed or inherited or studied. It is the knowledge that comes from having been in the dark and having found, not a light exactly, but a voice, and having followed the voice without knowing where it led, and having arrived somewhere you could not have predicted, but could not now imagine having missed. Song Yong-jae paid for that knowledge. He paid in the currency that God seems to prefer, not the grand gestures, not the dramatic sacrifices, but the long, unglamorous daily cost of a life that did not go according to the plan he had made at 15. And if his name is not in the history books, that may be because history measures the wrong things. There are roots that never become visible. There are prayers that entered the ground in 1907 and are still traveling. There are men whose most important work was done in a cellar, in a whisper, with their coats on, while someone they loved stood at the door.